The widowed cowboy meets the too old schoolteacher and the proposal that shook the whole town. The Wyoming plains were always harsh, but harsher still were the judging eyes of men. Daniel Holt had buried his heart with his late wife, living in solitude on a ranch crumbling under drought. Margaret Hayes, a gentle schoolteacher, left the glittering city behind for the West, only to receive a telegram canceling her wedding, dismissed as too old. But instead of breaking, fate brought them together at a station of broken dreams. With the whole town watching, Daniel made a reckless proposal. Margaret, trembling in tears, gave an answer that would change both their lives forever. This isn't just a love story, it's a lesson in courage, daring to seize a chance when the whole world turns away. The Wyoming sun poured fire over the cracked plains. For months, no rain had touched the earth, and the Holt Ranch stood stubborn against the drought like a sorrowful monument to time. Daniel Holt, a cowboy past 40, stepped out onto the porch, his frame heavy with weariness. In his shirt pocket, he still carried Clara's handkerchief, the wife he'd buried 3 years ago when fever took her. Sometimes his calloused hand would drift toward that scrap of faded cloth, the last thread tying him to a past still warm with love. The house creaked with suffocating silence. Only the wind's whistle through the cracks filled the air, stirring the dust that lay thick on the table. Daniel had grown used to the emptiness, though at times he still caught himself whispering, "Clara, can you hear me?" before the silence reminded him she never would again. From the barn came the cheerful voice of Eli Turner. "Mornin', Mr. Holt. Got the milkin' done. Left some in the kitchen for you." Daniel managed a faint smile, nodding instead of answering. Eli, just 17, motherless since childhood, had clung to this ranch like kin. Daniel loved him like a son, but knew he couldn't keep paying him much longer. 3 bank notices had already come. The 4th lay waiting on the kitchen table, a cold promise that if winter came with no rain, Holt Ranch would be gone. Daniel tore open the envelope. The words were familiar. Delinquent, foreclosure, final warning. He shoved it into his vest pocket. Eli didn't need that burden. But tucked behind was a smaller scrap of yellowed paper, scrawled with a strange symbol, a circle divided in 4, a crooked cross at its center. Daniel's heart jolted. He'd seen it once, in Clara's journal. She had whispered it was a mark her father kept in his diary, something tied to the very land they lived on. Back then, Daniel brushed it off as family folklore. But why now? Why in a banker's letter? Sweat trickled down his brow, though the sun burned dry above. It was as if Clara were trying to speak across the grave. Could this ranch hold a secret yet untouched? Eli's call from the stables pulled him back. "Mr. Holt, should I hitch the wagon for town?" Daniel tucked both the paper and Clara's handkerchief deep into his pocket. "Yes, Eli. Keep watch on the cattle. Wolves have been prowling the fence line again." He mounted the porch steps, eyes drifting to the dusty road toward Clearwater. He meant only to fetch sugar and a box of cartridges. But now, this trip might carry something far greater. The eastern train screeched into Clearwater Station, belching smoke and iron cries. From its doors stepped a woman of grace but weariness, out of place beneath the western sun. Margaret Hayes, 41, schoolteacher from Philadelphia. Her pale blue dress wrinkled from the long journey, her hat too flimsy for the scorching light. But her eyes, tired, hopeful, clinging to a thread-thin future, made her stand apart. She had come for one reason: marriage. Letters traded with a merchant named Herbert Crawford had promised her stability, a home on the prairie. After years of grading papers by candlelight in damp boarding rooms, she believed this might be her last chance at belonging. But instead of her betrothed, she received only a telegram. The messenger avoided her gaze, thrust the slip into her hand, and hurried off. The words cut like a blade. "Sorry. Family disapproves. Too old. Wedding cancelled. Margaret sat hard on the station bench, hands trembling over the note, vision blurring. Around her, chatter swelled, the humiliation sharpened by every whisper. 41 and still chasing marriage? Pitiful. All those years devoted to students, all her quiet hopes of family, vanished in ink. Dustwind was too small to keep a scandal, too cruel to show pity. Faces peered from shop windows, eyes measuring her with half pity, half scorn. Every step down the sand-choked street deepened her isolation. Yet in her worn valise lay more than a wedding dress. Stacked inside were letters never sent, dreams of a schoolhouse, of sowing knowledge across barren soil. That night, alone in her shabby inn room, she opened the bundle. Ink stains blurred, but a thought burned clear. If he turned away, perhaps destiny was forcing her to stand alone. By morning, the town already knew she'd been abandoned. During Sunday service, Pastor Collins lifted his Bible and declared, "A woman cast aside is not cast aside by God. What does Dustwind lack most? A school, a home for children. And this woman has carried that dream here herself." His words rippled through the crowd. Some averted their eyes, but mothers with children stared long and hard at Margaret. That afternoon, Henry Caldwell, the wealthiest rancher, eager to keep children as cheap labor, stepped into the street. He tossed coins at her feet. "If you fancy dreams, use that for a ticket back east. Schoolhouse? My boys need plows, not pens." Margaret's grip on her valise whitened. She left the coins on the ground, pulled out her thick manuscript, and raised it high. "If this town lacks a school, then I will build one, even if I stand alone, even if others try to snuff this fire out." Whispers surged. Children craned their necks to see the slight woman with her pages whipping in the wind. Defiance sparked, a flame no drought could quench. Margaret brushed away a final tear, but now it burned with resolve. Dustwind had witnessed the moment a woman scorned became a torch against the dark. And at sunset, on that station of broken dreams, her shadow stretched long across the platform. It was there, in the gathering dusk, that fate would lead her into a meeting no one could predict. If it were you, whose side would you stand on? A. Daniel Holt, the widower fighting to keep his dying ranch. B. Margaret Hayes, the woman cast aside for nothing but her age. Or someone else? Share your thoughts below so I know you're still following this story. Clearwater Station lay under a film of dust, the late sun stretching long bands of gold across the weathered planks. Daniel Holt reined in his horse at the steps, intending only to buy sugar, salt, and a handful of cartridges for the coming hunt. He tied off the reins, tugged his hat low to hide his weary eyes. All day, his mind had circled back to the strange slip of paper tucked into the banker's envelope. But then his gaze stopped short. On the far bench sat a woman, still as stone. Her dress was plain but neat, a valise at her side, her face bent low as though struggling with a shame she couldn't name. Daniel halted, his boots carrying him forward slow. In her shadowed eyes he saw something he knew too well. Loss. The very thing he had carried these 3 years since Clara's death. He cleared his throat, summoning a courage he hadn't touched in years. "Pardon me, ma'am. I left my spectacles at home. Might you help me read a few lines from this Bible?" From his vest he pulled a small, worn Bible, offering it out. His eyes were still keen. This was an old trick, one he had once used just to hear Clara's voice recite scripture, a tender ritual he had missed with every breath since she passed. The woman lifted her head, startled. Her voice wavered but was clear. Yes, of course." She opened the book at random. A few pressed flowers slipped free, fluttering down to rest against her skirt. Morning glory blossoms, faded, but their fragile shape intact. Margaret Hayes gasped, gathering them in trembling fingers. My word. This flower. I once studied it for my literature class. I wrote an essay on its meaning, that even in barren soil, it still reaches for the light. Daniel froze. Those same flowers, Clara had once tended along the old ranch fence. He had pressed them into the Bible as a keepsake. Now this stranger recognized them instantly, speaking the very words Clara once whispered. For a breathless moment, the distance between them dissolved. Two strangers on a dusty platform bound by memory, grief, and the stubborn spark of hope. Daniel's tired smile softened. Your name, ma'am? Margaret Hayes, from Philadelphia, she answered, her voice small but steady. The name hung in the twilight air, as if it had opened a chapter neither of them could yet see. Right there, at that battered station, fate quietly turned its wheel. The air stilled. Wind carried the scent of old timber, the faint wail of a train in the distance. Daniel Holt stood before Margaret Hayes, his heart stirring with emotions he thought long buried. Loneliness had shadowed his years, and he realized that merely existing was not the same as living. His voice came low and rough. I've lived in darkness these 3 years since Clara died. I thought I was alive, but I was only breathing. And now, looking into your eyes, I reckon maybe God hasn't forgotten me after all. Margaret's breath caught. Shamed only hours before by a broken engagement, she now heard words of startling honesty from a man she'd never known. His solemn gaze pressed on, warm and unwavering. Margaret, Daniel said, stepping closer, I won't waste another day in loneliness. If you'll allow it, here and now, before all these folks, I'd marry you. The platform fell silent. Townsfolk turned their heads, gasps slipping out. Some shook their heads. Others watched with wide-eyed curiosity. Margaret's cheeks flushed scarlet. She stepped back, voice trembling. You know nothing of me. I've been mocked for my age, called a burden. I can't let you be dragged into that shame. Daniel did not falter. His chin lifted, his eyes burning clear. Hear me, Margaret. Only a fool turns away from a heart that's weathered life. I saw your strength when you spoke of that flower, your kindness in every word. Age means nothing when weighed against a heart that knows how to love. His words struck deep, fanning the embers long smothered in Margaret's chest. Tears welled as she realized, after so many years, she was being seen not for her age, but for who she was. The crowd hushed as Daniel clasped her hand with steady reverence. A long moment passed before Margaret gave the faintest nod, quivering, but enough to shift the course of 2 lives. That very day, they walked to the small town hall. In a wooden chamber, with only a clerk and 2 chance witnesses, they signed their names and spoke plain vows, vows no less strong for their simplicity. The station, once steeped in despair, had become the unlikely birthplace of a story no one saw coming. If you were standing there, whose side would you take? A. Daniel Holt, the widower bold enough to seize a chance at happiness. B. Margaret Hayes, the woman once rejected, now faced with a proposal that defied all odds. Or someone else? Leave a comment, and let me know you're still following the story. The wagon jolted along the rough trail, carrying Daniel and Margaret back to Holt Ranch. The evening sun sank low, shadows of the hills crawling long across the cracked earth. When the sagging wooden gate finally came into view, Margaret clasped her hands tight in her lap, torn between worry and wonder. This was no grand estate like Herbert's letters once promised. It was a poor man's ranch, worn thin by drought and debt. Yet it was Daniel's, real, stubborn, enduring, and now, by fate's twist, it would be the first home of their unlikely marriage. From the barn came Eli Turner, face smeared with dust, eyes wide. "Boss, you got married?" he stammered, staring at Margaret like she'd stepped out of a ghost story. Daniel only chuckled, patting the boy's shoulder. He introduced them, and Margaret answered with a gentle smile that carried no distance in it. Within minutes, she was asking about Eli's chores, when he last ate. Her kindness chipped away at the boy's awkwardness until a grin broke free. Inside, the cabin was cloaked in cold. The stove sat dead, draped in dust. Margaret's fingers brushed across the table, leaving a clean streak. She drew a deep breath, peeled off her gloves, and rolled up her sleeves. Daniel started to protest, but the resolve in her eyes silenced him. Soon, the kitchen stirred with new life. She found an old cast-iron skillet, scrubbed it clean, coaxed a fire to life, and fried the last scraps of dried meat with the onions Eli had gathered. The smell filled the house, warm and savory, like breath poured back into a body. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching silently as this woman moved with quiet determination. For the first time in years, the hearth glowed red again, chasing shadows from the corners. The three of them sat down at the table. Eli ate with gusto, his eyes shining. Margaret ladled Daniel a bowl of broth, her voice low but steady. "This house may not have much, but if we keep the fire alive, it'll never truly be empty." Daniel nodded, throat tight. His hand drifted to the pocket where Clara's handkerchief still lay hidden. After supper, as Margaret cleared dishes, she reached for a jar on the high shelf. Her fingers struck something buried in dust. She pulled it down, a weathered wooden box, its lock rusted. Inside lay thin ledgers, pages cracked but legible. Daniel froze. The handwriting was unmistakable. Clara's. Every page marked with careful notes of debts, bargains, ways to stretch the ranch through lean years. His hands trembled as he turned them, and in his mind, Clara's voice rose clear. "Don't give up, Daniel. This ranch still has a chance." Margaret touched his arm gently. "Maybe this is what she meant to leave for you. For us." The firelight flickered across their faces, warming a fragile new hope born from ashes. Morning broke golden over the Wyoming plains. Sunlight spilled into every crack of the Holt cabin. Margaret woke early, wrapped a thin shawl, and stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp with cold, but what she saw stopped her breath. Along the old fence, vines had crept and bloomed. Blue morning glories, bright and defiant, opened their faces to the sun. She knelt, fingertips brushing the delicate petals. She remembered them well, flowers she once wrote about in her lessons, fragile yet unyielding, always lifting toward the light. Her heart trembled, for they mirrored her own spirit, worn but not broken. Behind her came Daniel's heavy steps. His face went rigid at the sight. Clara planted them," his voice cracked. 3 years, and I haven't dared touch them." Margaret turned, her gaze soft but steady. "They're still alive, Daniel, and they don't bloom only for the past. They can bloom for the future." He gripped the handkerchief in his pocket, torn between grief and solace. Before him, Margaret gently cleared the weeds at the roots, as though carrying forward a dream left unfinished. His heart ached and healed all at once. They sat together on the steps. Margaret opened her valise and drew out a thick stack of papers, her handwriting neat and sure. "This is what I've written for years. A plan for a community school for the ranch children. I know. This place has an empty room. If you'll allow it, I want to turn it into a classroom." Daniel stared at the pages, heavy with memory. Clara had once dreamed of Holt Ranch being more than cattle and dust, a place that sowed hope for children. Now another woman, wounded yet steadfast, carried that same fire. "I'm afraid," Daniel whispered. "Afraid they'll laugh. That Holt Ranch can barely feed itself, let alone teach others." Margaret's eyes locked with his, unwavering. "They might laugh, but the children won't. They need words the way this land needs rain." Silence lingered. Then Daniel gave a small nod. An unspoken pact. Sunlight spread across the morning glories, their blue petals glowing with promise. On that old porch, between Clara's memory and Margaret's resolve, a beginning took root. If it were you, whose side would you take? Optu. Daniel Holt, the man still shackled by memory. B. Margaret Hayes, the woman bold enough to plant hope in dry ground. Or another choice? Leave a comment below so I know you're still with the story. That afternoon, the prairie sky turned dark, black clouds rolling in like a rising sea. Wind screamed across the hills, tearing at dust and the scent of scorched earth. Daniel Holt was inspecting the north fence when he heard the crack. One rotten post snapped under the gale, and the fence toppled. In an instant, the herd panicked, horns clashing, hooves pounding as cattle bolted into the open plain. "Lord help us!" Daniel shouted, whip slashing the air. Eli Turner burst from the barn, face pale. "Boss, if they reach the cliffs..." Before Daniel could answer, another figure appeared. Margaret, skirts hitched high, vaulted onto a bay mare. She seized the reins, eyes blazing in the dust. "I'm coming with you," she cried. "No, it's too dangerous," Daniel roared. But she dug in her heels, the horse leaping forward into the stampede. Daniel cursed under his breath, then spurred after her, Eli close behind. Wind burned their faces, dust choked their lungs. The herd thundered wild, horns clanging, balls echoing across the prairie. Daniel rode alongside Margaret, his heart twisted in fear and awe. Only yesterday she had trembled on a station bench. Now she tore across the storm, hair whipping free, a schoolteacher turned fearless rider. They pushed the herd toward safer ground until a calf broke loose, stumbling straight toward the canyon's edge. Earth crumbled under its hooves, rocks tumbling into the deep. "The calf!" Eli shouted. Daniel jerked his reins, but Margaret was already flying ahead. She leaned low, snatching the loose rope dangling from the calf's neck. Her horse screamed, hooves skidding to a halt only steps from the abyss. Dust and stones rained down, but she held tight, dragging the calf back from death's mouth. Daniel rushed in, looping his rope around the animal, steadying it with her. Both of them heaved, sweat and dirt streaking their faces. Daniel's voice shook between admiration and anger. "Woman, you're mad. No schoolteacher could have done what you just did." Margaret's breath came ragged, but she managed a faint smile. "On the prairie or in a classroom, Daniel, it takes the same courage." By storm's end, the herd was gathered safe. When they returned to the ranch, rain finally poured down, heavy drops drumming the roof, washing away dust and fear alike. Inside Daniel, something shifted. The woman he had wed on a reckless whim was no frail burden. She was strength itself, standing shoulder to shoulder with him against the fury of the land. When the rain cleared, the prairie smelled of wet soil. Pools shimmered in the fading light. But Holt Ranch lay battered, the north fence shattered, posts strewn, mud sucking at their boots. Daniel stood among the wreckage, weary but strangely grateful. Without Margaret, he would have lost more than cattle, perhaps even his will. Margaret did not rest. With Eli at her side, she bound her shawl tight and set to rebuilding. Her hands, once ink-stained from chalk and paper, now blistered from hammer and rope. Daniel watched her work, a knot rising in his chest. The woman he had taken as wife was not clinging to promises. She was proving herself with every strike. "Boss, it's too heavy," Eli grunted, staggering with a post. Margaret steadied it, deftly setting it upright. "Let me. I've built taller platforms for my pupils to stand on," she said with a smile, sweat streaking her brow. Daniel let out a laugh, the first true laugh in months. The sound of hammer against wood seemed to pulse life back into the ranch. As he tied off the last rope, Daniel stepped back. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass, nourished by rare rain. Then, near a broken tree, he caught a glint of metal. Kneeling, he unearthed a rusted iron box, the home latch still held. His heart thundered as he pried it open. Inside lay yellowed pages, and atop them the handwriting he knew by heart. Clara's. His breath hitched as he read, "If you found this, Daniel, it means God willed it so. Don't let grief chain you in the dark. If love comes again, open your heart. The future is no betrayal to the past. It is how I may finally rest in peace." Tears blurred the words. The wind seemed to carry Clara's voice, soft and far. Daniel lifted his head and saw Margaret bent at the fence, the last light painting her in gold. He folded the letter with trembling hands, slipping it into his inner pocket beside Clara's handkerchief. Something within him shifted, gentle but sure. Clara had given her blessing from beyond, and Margaret had given him reason to live forward. "Margaret," he called, voice carrying across the field. "The fence is mended. There's more work yet, but this time I believe we'll keep this ranch." She lifted her face, smiling, eyes steady with faith. Holt Ranch, scarred by storm, now stood rebuilt not just with wood and rope, but with a force stronger still, the force of hope and of human hearts bound together. If you were here, whose side would you stand on? Oh, Daniel Holt, the man who found a blessing from the past. B. Margaret Hayes, the woman who turned herself into the ranch's pillar. Or someone else? Leave a comment below so I know you're still with the story. Morning light spilled through the ranch windows, glinting across open pages spread on the rough-hewn table. Margaret sat tall, steel pen scratching steady lines. She had turned the empty north room into a makeshift classroom and workroom, where numbers and ink began rewriting Holt Ranch's fate. Clara's old ledgers, paired with Margaret's years of bookkeeping skill, became salvation. Expenses, income, debts once tangled in confusion now lined up neat and true. Mistakes of the past were corrected, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt his chest ease as he looked over the figures. "Never thought a woman could set straight what had me tangled for so long," Daniel muttered, eyes fixed on the ledger. "Not a woman," Margaret answered softly, a faint smile tugging her lips. "A teacher. We're used to turning children's chaos into order." Outside, Eli's laughter rang with the children who'd come to learn. A blackboard, nailed from old planks, bore chalk-scratched sums. Margaret taught the little ones their addition and subtraction, while between lessons she guided the farmers' wives on keeping household accounts. "Every coin spent must leave a mark," she explained, drawing examples from the ranch itself. "Same with life. We must know what we've lost and what we've gained." The room buzzed with pencils scratching, paper turning, and eyes shining bright as lanterns in a winter night. Slowly, the community that once eyed the woman from the east with suspicion began to nod with quiet respect. Daniel watched from the doorway. In his hands, a carving knife and a block of wood, half-shaped into a chess piece. The idea had come when Margaret spoke of life's strategies. "Every game needs foresight," he told Eli, showing the boy the rough-hewn knight. "Same as life. You don't always win by force. Sometimes patience wins the day." At night, after lessons and chores, the three gathered around the oil lamp. On the table lay the unfinished chess set. Margaret listened intently as Daniel explained the moves, while Eli leaned in wide-eyed, as if discovering a new world. The pieces on the board became more than a game. They were proof of another strategy, rebuilding life together. The ranch began to stir back to life, not only through neat ledgers but through shared purpose. The townsfolk grew more trusting. The children found a place to learn. And in Holt Ranch, the long-dead flame of family flickered anew. One cold prairie night, the wind wailed against the shutters, sneaking through the cracks with icy breath. But in the Holt kitchen, the stove glowed warm, painting the room gold. On the table, instead of ledgers or carved pieces, lay a pile of mismatched cloth squares, each with its own story. Margaret spread them gently. A torn scrap of dark brown canvas from Daniel's old work shirt. He'd long meant to throw it away, but she kept it. "Anything that's weathered the sun and wind deserves remembering," she said. Beside it lay a frayed blue scarf Margaret had carried from Boston, still faint with familiar scent, and a strip of red ribbon pressed into her hand by Mary Beth, the little girl who whispered, "So we'll always know we truly have a teacher." Daniel frowned slightly at the heap. Never figured needle and thread could build a home. Margaret's eyes glimmered in the firelight. A quilt doesn't just warm the body. It gathers memories, stitches torn edges into something new. He ran his rough fingers over the scrap of his old shirt, as if the thread yet to be sewn could stitch together the broken seams of his own life. So they worked. Margaret cut. Daniel clumsily threaded needles. Sometimes the stitches strayed crooked, and he grumbled. But Margaret only smiled, laying her hand over his. "A crooked stitch still holds, just like we hold to each other." The night stretched on with the wind outside and the whisper of needle through cloth. Piece by piece, the quilt took form. When Margaret added a beige square, Daniel froze. He recognized it from Clara's old apron. Memory surged sharp, but this time he didn't pull away. Margaret's voice came quiet. "I don't wish to replace her. I just want your past to have a place in this present." Daniel's eyes burned, but he nodded. Perhaps this was how Clara remained, woven into memory, sewn alongside what was new. When the quilt was finished, they spread it across the table. It was no fine tapestry, uneven, rough in places, but it glowed like a painting. Each patch a memory, each stitch a promise. Daniel laid his hand upon it and whispered, "This isn't just a quilt. It's our story." Margaret smiled, firelight shining in her eyes like stars. In that moment, Holt Ranch was no longer just a patch of land clawing against drought. It was a place where love was reborn from memory and loss. If it were you, whose side would you take? A. Daniel Holt, the man learning to stitch his wounds from the past. B. Margaret Hayes, the woman who turned memory into new love. Or someone else? Leave a comment below so I know you're still with the story. A year had passed since the day Daniel Holt made the boldest choice of his life at that little station. Now here they were again, but no longer as two lost souls. They returned as a family. That morning, the station bustled brighter than ever. Folks from across the valley gathered, heavy coats lined shoulder to shoulder, their voices mingling with laughter that filled the street. Children darted between legs, some of them the very first pupils of the Holt Ranch School. In their hands, they carried blue morning glory blossoms picked from the fence line, scattering joy like tiny heralds. Margaret stood at the far end of the platform, dressed in a simple cream gown, a fresh flower pinned in her hair. She clasped her sister Elizabeth's hand, who had journeyed all the way from Philadelphia to be here. Tears shone in Elizabeth's eyes as she whispered, "You've found your true home at last, Margaret." Across the platform, Daniel appeared, tall, lean, his worn brown coat brushed clean for the occasion. In his hand, he still carried Clara's embroidered handkerchief, not a burden now, but a silent blessing. When his gaze met Margaret's, the crowd's chatter faded, leaving only the pounding of two hearts. The town pastor climbed onto a small wooden stand set before the weathered depot. His voice, deep and steady, carried across the hush. 1 year ago, this place bore witness to two broken souls finding each other. Today, it witnesses them beginning anew, not in silence but embraced by the whole community. The station grew still. Wind stirred the vines of morning glories twining the rafters, blossoms swaying as if nodding their approval. Margaret's breath caught. Daniel's hand tightened over hers. No longer did the townsfolk look on with doubt. Their eyes now brimmed with respect. The woman once dismissed as too old was honored by all, and the man long buried in grief had found the strength to love again. The words, "I do," rang from both their lips, firm, steady, the echo of lives rebuilt together. Cheers erupted, children tossed morning glories into the air. Adults clapped till the boards shook. Elizabeth pulled her sister close, weeping with joy, while Eli, no longer the shy ranch hand, grinned proudly, as if he too belonged to this new family. In that moment, the old depot became more than a place where trains came and went. It became a chapel of hope. And the morning glories, once tied to Clara's memory, now bloomed as a wreath of blessing for both past and future. That evening, golden light spilled across Holt Ranch. In the new classroom carved from the old barn, laughter filled the air. Eli darted between benches, helping children scrawl crooked letters on the blackboard. Margaret stood at the front, eyes glowing. She was no longer the woman abandoned at a station. She was a teacher, a wife, a cornerstone of a home. Daniel lingered at the doorway, shoulder against the frame, watching it all. He saw the children's joy, Eli's quiet growth, but most of all he saw Margaret. Her hands, once stitching torn cloth, now tracing letters of hope in chalk. He stepped inside. The class erupted in greetings. Margaret turned, her smile catching the last rays of sunlight. Daniel moved close, whispering low, "Margaret, that day at the station, when I dared to take the risk, I found my life again." Her eyes widened, then softened. She squeezed his hand, her smile answering without words. In that instant, every shadow of fear, every cruel whisper, every ghost of the past melted away. What remained was simple truth. Together, they had built a home out of ashes. Eli tugged a rope in the corner, and the school bell rang out. Its sound carried across the prairie, rolling long and sweet. Children cheered, leaping with joy, as though the chime itself marked the dawn of a new era. Daniel and Margaret exchanged a look. Both knew Holt Ranch had done more than survive. It had become a seedbed for the future, a place where memory and loss had been stitched into a warm quilt, where love knew no age and bowed to no prejudice. The bell tolled on, blending with the prairie wind, proclaiming what they now believed with all their hearts. Life, when dared with open hands, always grants the chance to begin again. As the school bell echoed across the plains, Daniel and Margaret's story closed like a gentle hymn of fate. Two wounded souls had found each other, building a home from memory, loss, and hope. Love asks no age, bows to no judgment. It only asks for two hearts brave enough to open. What about you? Would you risk it all like Daniel, daring one reckless choice to reclaim life? Or would you be like Margaret, patient enough to stitch torn fragments into a quilt of warmth? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this channel so more folks can join us in these journeys of the Wild West. Sometimes, all it takes is one small choice to open a whole new life.